Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for another Roscoe webinar. This time we're talking about lighting with gobos and textures, and we're joined by lighting designer Al Crawford. My name is Chad Tiller. I'm the North American Director of Sales, and I want to thank all of you for joining us today. As I mentioned, we're excited to be joined by Al Crawford. Al has been the lighting director of the world-renowned Alvin Ailey American Dance Theater since 1998. He's now in his 20th season with the famed dance company. He has produced the lighting for Ailey in virtually every major theater, performing arts center, and opera house on the planet. He's toured to 48 of the United States and over 60 countries, including historically significant performances in Russia, China, and South Africa. A huge believer in cross-genre design, Al also founded Arc3 Design, a design company dedicated to merging his theatrical aesthetic into all areas of art, architecture, dance, live music, theater, broadcast, and live event production. We are thrilled to have Al with us today. Al and Roscoe have worked together many times over the years, and we love his work so much that we've even added his designs to the Roscoe Gobo catalog. You can read more about that design and the story behind it on the Spectrum blog post. Visit roscoe.com and click in the upper corner to go to the Spectrum blog post. During today's webinar, Al's going to share some stories and photos from his portfolio of projects, as well as some tips for lighting with gobos and textures. So Al, thank you for joining us. How are you doing today?
I'm great. Good morning, Chad. It's such a pleasure to talk with you, as always.
An absolute pleasure, and the pleasure is mine. Again, Al, I'm hoping you can share some examples in your work where textured light has played a predominant role. And really, I wanted you to start with, what does texture in light mean to you?
That's an excellent question, Chad. So I think one thing I'd love to really sort of point out as we start this discussion is texture for me is not necessarily just related to gobo in a light. Texture is a quality of light that, for me, of course, all of us as lighting designers work slightly differently, and there are no rules. But texture for me is really this quality of light that how it hits an object, how it hits air, how it cuts through volume, and that's a number of variety of reasons affect how that light is seen as a texture. So specifically, thinking about something like a PAR 64, an old school CP62 classic PAR 64 can, a narrow, that light has a different texture of light on an object, on a body, than what would say an ETC Source 4 narrow.
Sure.
That's just a simple example of, the quality of light coming out of it and how it hits an object are different, not necessarily using gobos. Same thing with a classic Lico. A Lico just sharp hitting an object, Lico with frost, there is a textural change in the quality of light that's coming out and actually how it's being used. Also, it may not have anything to do with necessarily the light that's coming out, but the objects that are on stage. So texture can come from shooting through scenic elements, through fabrics, through humans. So for example, and I'll show you some examples here later, but in dance where you've got lots of people on stage and there's lots of shadows, and those shadows are layering onto other people. That to me is texture and light.
Sure,
so
even haze in the air, right?
Totally. So I want us as designers to think about texture much like a visual art thinks about it, an artist thinks about it, and less like what is the sort of technical way of adding this quality of light to the stage, right? So that being said, I've put together a combination of a variety of few images from different projects of different genres that I thought specifically spoke to our particular use of texture and might be of interest to the group. So I'm just going to start through here.
Great.
As Chad said, a lot of our work is not necessarily in classic theatrical environments. It's certainly where we started from a design history, but we've now really moved into doing a lot of immersive experience, this cross genre of design for environmental spaces and theatrical space with a theatrical sort of sensibility. So texture, in classic theatrical sense, texture is used in the same ways in those different genres. This is an image of the White House East Colonnade. It's essentially a hallway that connects the East Wing to the main house of the White House, and this is for holidays a number of years ago. I say a number of years ago. And as you can see here, there's a lot of texture on the walls, this sort of snowflake pattern that's projected, texture amongst this snowflake pattern in the ceiling. But to point out, there are no gobos. This is purely soft, cool white light shooting through objects, passing through objects, layering onto each other, laying onto the walls, projecting the image of those objects onto the walls, just using light without gobos. So just a sort of keen example of that.
Yeah, it's almost like if you're walking through a park and you see a dappled shadow on the ground as the light filters through the trees above you. There's no gobos in there, but textured light is all around us all the time, right?
That's exactly right. The moon doesn't have a gobo in front of it, but it's certainly taking advantage of the tree that's 30 feet above your head.
Yeah.
Just kind of stepping through. Again, very, very different kind of event. This is a John Frieda Hair Products launch. We do a lot of brand strategy launches and events like this. But again, this really became a story of what's the style of the event, right? So they wanted something that was very edgy, contemporary. And as you can see, there's a few textured elements here on the walls in the back. This is a custom gobo made for the walls to ultimately give us a very sort of contemporary graphic kind of look. And then you can see sort of softly on the floor there, kind of a basket weave broken pattern to kind of play against the wood, what we would consider the texture of the wood floor, right? So,
right.
Really
so looking at this photo, Al, you've spoken with your client, you've identified that they want this, to use your words, edgy and contemporary style. At what point in the process do you say this needs a gobo?
Well, it certainly comes down to your light plot, right? So, I look at the rest of the space that's being built ultimately. If that space is all super clean and the idea is super sort of crisp and maybe it's a monochromatic idea and maybe the walls are all flat. And as a team, and there's lots of other people who are going to be interested in this conversation, we all decide that we want this very sort of crisp, soft light look, then a gobo would not be an option. If we all come to the page where we say we want this very multi-dimensional kind of layered look where, it's there's some interesting exploration of light and little cool pockets of dapple into the corners, and maybe an envelope the walls, if you will, with something that's dynamic and moving, well, then a texture makes sense, right? So it really is a conversation and comes down to the overall environment that's being created.
That's interesting to me because you talk about environmental sort of hints that lead you towards making that choice. As I look at this particular picture, I'm drawn immediately to the highlighted mannequins there and the ampersand in the middle, and that ampersand seems to be a reflective metallic kind of gold look because I'm seeing the sort of sharp reflections on the ground. Again, texture that's not created by a gobo, right?
Oh yeah, and happy accidents. I'd be lying to you if I knew that was going to be a great looking, reflection on the floor.
Sure.
So.
But it seems to me that if this were a smooth, even, illumination of the, that sort of magenta into the warmer area around the display, without that texture on the floor, that ampersand reflection might feel out of place. Maybe not, but I see there are ways where the environment could influence that decision.
Yeah, I also really like to use textures in a way that you see here to sort of merge from space to space. So, for example, you'll see that sort of seating area with the teal and the magenta kind of around it. And that gobo is basically being used as almost a dithering paintbrush, if you will, into the gold, into the amber. That it's not just purple over here and it's gold over here. That gobo becomes a bridge, right? That texture becomes a way of transitioning or ombreing light into a new space or a new quality of light space.
Sure. If you had to guess, how many fixtures are being used in this particular photo?
I mean, this is a much larger room that we don't see, but this is at Jazz at Lincoln Center, using their incredible rep plot by Zach Alalami, and probably in this image alone, I would say there's at least 30 to 40 fixtures just in these areas.
Gotcha. I'm as we have this conversation, I'm folding in a couple of the questions from the audience. And one of the questions, do you use pre-visualization or do you go in and create on the spot?
We do use pre-visualization. It's certainly part of different projects' workflow. Not every project has the time to do pre-visualization. Not every project necessarily has the need or necessity. Previs is a really great tool, and it's really great for communicating to clients what it looks like. I have a pretty clear picture in most situations in my head about what it's going to look like. So it is usually, for me in particular, it's a great tool to express to others, or if you're time challenged, to start to layer things in, etc. But hopefully that answers that.
Excellent.
I'm going to step on to the next. Again, jumping around genres here, use of texture. This particular band that you see has a group called Classic Albums Live. Some of you may have lit them around the country. It's an organization out of Canada that does full albums, front to back performances on stage, for everything from Led Zeppelin to The Wall to Beatles albums, etc. It's really great, and it's all about the music. It's not staged or over the top. So we had the opportunity to light them quite a bit when they come into the tri-state area. This particular image, again, was a situation where we didn't have any moving lights, we didn't have any technology, not a lot of, it wasn't a big budget kind of situation. So we created this fan of just 26-degree source 4s upstage with gobos passing through haze, coming back at the audience, which gives it almost a canopy of light above the band. We can individually control them, layered together. It becomes an incredibly textural sort of idea with a lot of impact. It could be a moment that could be used for hits or really soft and subtle for ballads. So again, it's, here's an idea of a gobo not being projected onto an object necessarily, but being projected back towards you in space. Most of us who work in music, this is very normal concept, but again, it doesn't always have to be a moving light that's doing it.
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful photo. And what's interesting is, I'm sure if I'm the band, I'm looking into the house and I see on the back wall some very strange pattern that you've projected that maybe the audience never sees, because really what you're showing them is the beams as it cascades through that haze.
Totally. Yeah, don't look back there.
Fair enough. Pay no attention to the gobos behind the curtain, right?
Exactly. Just pushing forward back to a theater piece, which I think a lot of people on this webinar probably can connect with comfortably. This is Guys and Dolls, super fun. I had the great joy of going back to my alma mater, the North Carolina School of the Arts, to design the school's 50th anniversary production of Guys and Dolls, the anniversary of the school, I should say. And this was an all-school production. Great to work with all the students there on this. Again, use of texture in this situation, a couple layers here. So primarily your first sort of focus layer around the group. This is the classic Luck Be a Lady sequence. And again, texture coming out of, in this scenario, a series of moving lights to really pull in the sort of visual arrows, if you will, to play off the sort of dynamics of the music. This whole scene takes place in an underground kind of hidden sewer. So, maybe the sort of vocabulary of light coming through the cracks of the roof, kind of continuing on with that idea. But then a secondary layer, ultimately, of sunlight, this warm light, very specifically, that's layering in this very sort of 2D scenery in the back to create some depth of field. In the back there's basically 3 layers of painted 2-dimensional drops. And what I wanted to do is to be able to sort of break up the eye so we can't necessarily see so much the individual layers of what's happening, but we get a sense of perspective and a sense of depth, as if that whole of stage is going on forever. Right? So that's sort of my approach in terms of texture in this section.
Sure, and as you have identified that you recognize you wanted the cracks coming through the sort of roof of the room, for lack of a better word, and if it's a sewer, that leads me immediately to think of like sewer grates, right?
Yep.
So you've identified that that's the theme of texture that you want to create from above. How do you go about choosing the Gobo now? There's Roscoe has in Roscoe's catalog 2,500 standard images, and there are I hear there are other manufacturers of Gobos out there. I'm not certain about that, but I heard. So my question to you is, with all of the options of patterns there, how do you know which one is right for you? How do you choose it?
Well, I'm going to start by having a vision, right, about what it is that the sort of quality of texture that I want to project. And so for this particular scene, I knew it wanted to be something that was linear or grid patterned or slots or slates or, sort of light coming through something architectural, like a grid, like a manhole, like a something sort of like
really an industrial design.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah. So all of those vocabularies of words come first, and maybe I go and I look for textures in imagery as I'm building sort of a scene by scene visualization kind of mood board, if you will, of textures as I'm starting to build my ideas for this particular scene. And then once I have that built, that sort of that collection of imagery that I'm going for, I then go to the Roscoe website, which is super easy to navigate, and can put in those keywords. I can put in grid. I can put in window or slash or linear or industrial. And because of the great sort of tagging that's happened and naming of these Gobos, it gives me a bespoke collection of things based on all those keywords. And then I can look and see what's going on, right? And so then the next question becomes, does the catalog give me in sort of the vast options that I need, or do I need to take something and make it custom? That's the sort of moment in which I make that choice, right? In this particular scene, the overheads are likely stock Gobos from the moving lights that were being used, but that Gobo in the back is definitely a stock image that came out of the Roscoe catalog. That it was, 2 lights on a balcony rail that have been framed down to it, softened just slightly, and layered on, and that's the process that was used to pull that out.
You actually asked one of the questions that was asked about those, what's the hang position for the grids on the back of the scenery there.
Yeah.
And another question real fast before we steer away from Guys and Dolls. somebody wanted to know what kind of instruments are the green sort of area wash.
Those are ETC D60s.
D60s, great.
All right. Moving forward, this is more of a music / opera / classical music performance piece. This is Leonard Bernstein's Mass, and this is a very rarely produced piece of music and theater. But this particular year right now is actually the 100th birthday of Leonard Bernstein, and so a lot of, I wouldn't say a lot, but there are a number of productions around the world that are doing this, attempting, I should say, to do this piece. It's a cast of almost 300. It takes incredible level of singers and musicians to do this. There's a rock band, there's a kazoo band, there's a marching band, there's a 100-piece orchestra, there's multiple choirs, so it takes a lot to be able to produce this. So from a lighting perspective, you might imagine a piece of this complexity with as many moving parts as it has is a pretty challenging approach for light. So this picture is from the Philadelphia Orchestra production of Bernstein's Mass from about 3 years ago. I just did another one recently at Ravinia Festival in Chicago, and it's one of my career favorite pieces in the world to do. So this image in particular, though, kind of jumping back into texture, really, again, it comes down to vocabulary, right? So the space itself is, as the set designer, which is often the first person involved in a production like this, created this very linear, horizontal plane vocabulary, maybe because of the nature of the space it was in, or the layout of the orchestra, et cetera. It always has this linear space anyway. But the vocabulary of that set, before we were involved, meaning lighting and video and costumes and everybody else, became very linear. And so the sort of secondary layer that happened were these tubes. These are iColor Cove accent tubes in the back, by the projection designer, created this sort of video opportunity in the back that could layer in with our light. Again, linear light in the sort of deck that you can see, sort of backlit plexiglass along that upstage platform. And so the texture, the space tells you the vocabulary of textures. The environment it hands it to you. So this particular moment, here's a situation where I wanted to have this sort of back diagonal slash of light through space, and I had to make a decision. Am I going to soften this texture so it feels more organic, or am I going to keep it sharp? And it became a choice throughout that was consistent throughout the whole piece, that I was going to be more bold than I was necessarily comfortable with about the use of Gobos, that it was really crisp and clear, and I wanted to see the graphic nature of it because of the rest of the room was giving me that same information. So.
Yeah, wow, it's a beautiful shot. Appreciate you taking us through the thought process a bit there. You mentioned that the projection designer sort of, I won't say mimicked, but there's definitely a vocabulary in what the projection designer is doing and what you're doing. Can you talk? I don't want to take us too field, but can you talk for a second about the collaboration specifically with a projection designer? It seems like so much of their work has to be in the vocabulary of the Gobos. Can you talk to that for a second?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think more and more as projection is becoming a key layer of all kinds of theatrical experience, whether it's a brand event or a theater event, et cetera. That synergy between lighting and projection is what makes something successful with those elements. The kind of conversations I have with projection designers when I have the great opportunity to collaborate with one is about that, exactly that. It's the vocabulary of color. It's the vocabulary of textures. It's the way things move in time from an idea to another idea. It's the way things move in physical space, in terms of an image changing on the background as it relates to an image changing in light on the stage, or the way the set is changing in that same way. So the more conversations that are happening about that kind of vocabulary, moment to moment, scene to scene, piece to piece, music to music, doesn't matter what genre it is, the closer a synergy between light and projection and scenic and music and art will all come together.
Yeah, good. It's what when my wife and I go and see, we talk about whether or not everybody was making the same play.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Good place to start.
Doesn't always happen, but
That's true. That's true.
Thing when it does. So, kind of moving forward, as you mentioned, I'm the lighting director of Alvin, Ailey American Dance Theater. It is definitely my home base, my love, if you will. It's the place that basically I grew up at, and built my voice and my aesthetic, and so I'm honored to have been there for 20 years and continue to run around the world with them. So this particular image is from a ballet from a few years ago. I've done 30 ballets with Ailey over the years. This was one of my favorites. It's a piece called Go in Grace. It was a collaboration between choreographer and company member Hope Boykin, who is a very close friend and basically family member, and Sweet Honey and the Rock, the music group that we've known for forever. And so Sweet Honey was very much involved on stage in terms of the choreography, etc. This particular moment, it's really just pointing out that sort of a synergy between movement and light and texture, right? So the choreographer Hope Boykin really wanted a moment that showed movement in space, that showed that we are moving towards something, that showed that we are pushing in a certain physical direction, that we are right. And so for me to be able to translate that became a combination, yes, of the light that is coming from what would be stage right in this photograph that they're all sort of looking into or moving towards, but in an effort to push that even more, this textural idea in the background that is pushing them, right, into that diagonal, and pushing them into that space, pushing them towards that that hopeful place, whatever the idea might be. So just a sort of simple, but for me, an important moment working with Hope and the company and Sweet Honey.
So to help clarify, this is a static pattern projected from stage left, I assume on one of the booms, shooting the cyclorama towards stage right as it appears that she is exiting or moving in that direction.
That is correct. And I suspect that this is probably just two Licos on a stand, like a 6-foot Altman stand up left, sitting in the wing with two static Gobos. As I remember, you can sort of see a little bit of color dithering. This was probably a split color. So it was a classic sort of standard steel Roscoe Gobo with a diagonal split of a darker blue and a lighter blue to get this sort of layered look out of not having to have 4 fixtures. I could do it with 2. Right? And what I'm talking about is taking Roscoe gel and cutting it on a diagonal and putting 2 colors in the light. I know it's crazy, right?
Very, very high tech.
We still do it all the time. I love a split color. I love a color donut. I love a reverse color donut. I love a diagonal split. I love a diagonal split diffusion. Right. So have fun with color media. How you manipulate a single fixture with a single gobo is so affected by what you put in that light in the front of it. Right. If you have just a classic gobo like you see here, which is a sort of open breakup of sorts, and you take 2 colors and you put it in the front of that lens and you run the barrel just slightly, and then you put a tiny bit of diffusion on one side of it, suddenly this doesn't feel like a light. it feels like light coming from something. It feels like light that's been made by some level of nature.
Interesting.
And so play with diffusions, play with, the gobo and the barrel position, play with split colors. We're so caught up right now in, is the moving light color mixing so perfect and so optically clear that suddenly when I go to, or even LED fixtures to that matter, like how perfect can we make the optical plane? I miss the ability to make a light feel not symmetrical and feel not perfect. I just did a piece where I had a variety of what we all might consider one of the best LED fixtures out there in terms of LECOs, and they were on rover stands lighting a backdrop, and I did everything in my power to be able to make them not so perfect through diffusion media, through gobos, through barrel edging, and I wanted to look like a 360Q. Yes, I was trying to make a $5,000 LECO look like a 360Q. That's what I was doing. So,
sometimes if that's the vocabulary of the look, right?
Yeah.
There's a very technical question in the chat bar about split color, and that very technical question is, are you using Scotch tape?
I am using Scotch tape. Yep. There's no fancy nothing going on. I think maybe my team, I don't know exactly the product, but we have a tape that's used for our scrollers
Sure.
that I believe is, and maybe you can speak to this because you guys make our scrollers. Yes, we still use scrollers.
It's been a while since I've personally taped color scrolls together, so I won't personally speak to it on this venue. How about that?
Yeah, but I think we use that when it's something that's going to be long-term in our rep, and we want it to be robust. So,
great.
But Scotch tape works fine, totally fine. Okay, moving on to something new. Again, Alvin, Ailey, American Dance Theater. This is a piece by Miss Judith Jamison, who's the artistic director for many, many, many years. Incredible dancer and director and choreographer. Amazing woman. So this was a piece called Here Now. It was commissioned by the 2002 Olympic Games, the Cultural Olympiad during that year. So this particular image from a texture is a classic example of use of Roscoe prismatics. It's actually about the first, right when the prismatic came out. So prismatic, if you guys don't know specifically, is basically taking, Roscoe takes dichroic glass, breaks it up, puts it on to a glass sort of base, and then molds it all together, and then you can put it inside of your light. And what it basically does is refract all the light inside of that prismatic glass. And so what comes out of the LECO is incredibly layered, incredibly broken. And by playing with the barrel on the LECO, you get so many interesting things that you can do with prismatic. So this was my first use of prismatics.
Pardon my interruption, but I want to help clarify for the audience who may not know. So dichroic glass is the name dichroic, two color. The concept is that there is a mirror-like finish applied to the glass, and that mirror-like finish is specifically calibrated to reflect some wavelengths of light and allowing colors to pass through. So in some ways it acts like a color filter. It is a color filter, but not absorbing those colors. It's reflecting and passing certain colors. The interesting thing, because it's based on the concept of reflection, the angle of incidence and the angle of reflection becomes very important. If we all remember our physical science class from 8th grade, right? And if you hit a dichroic glass at a 90-degree angle, you'll get the sort of prescribed color, the color we were going for, a really rich magenta or amber in certain instances. But if you hit it at an off-axis angle, a 45 or wider angle, you're going to start finding aberrations in that color. It's going to pass color in a different way. So what's neat about these prismatics is that it intentionally plays with that trait of dichroics to give you really organic color mixes.
Definitely. It's super fun. There's so many different versions of the dichro prismatics by Roscoe that, there's lots of color combinations. There are blue, green, teals. There's sort of more monochromatic blues. So a super fun way to make something super layered and super textural just by use of one glass gobo.
Great. Now, I'm seeing circles on the costuming. Did that vocabulary translate anywhere into your lighting?
Yeah, there are a few moments that, instead of a pool of light where you might think the dancer would move into to do a solo or something, as I remember, I used more of a ring where they would dance internally inside, trying to be a bit subtle about it because the rings motif definitely was something that came from the idea that it was an Olympic-inspired piece. This piece was about Flojo and sort of the life that she led, her Olympic story. So, yes, there were definitely some curvilinear ideas. I actually did the set for this particular piece, which was this sort of curved ramp structure that the dancers would go up and dance on and sort of layer up on stage. And there's actually a mimicking sort of, as you can see there, the deck, there was actually a floating version of that above in the sky as well. So yes, a curve idea certainly made its way into other parts of the design. Just sort of pumping through again. Again, Alvin Ailey American Dance Theater. This is a piece called Love Stories, again by Judith Jamison. This, I think is a slightly different example of the use of textured light, sort of classic example, if you will. This really was and it's really what you see on the floor there. It was a layering of windows, and it was for a solo called If It's Magic. And it's one of those moments in the piece's very beginning, actually, where, it's a male solo. We first see him. He feels, a bit internal. He's thinking. He's in a space. If you guys don't know the Stevie Wonder song, If It's Magic, the words are basically talking about, self sort of being kind of aware of the world and the sort of spirit, right? And I felt like light through windows coming from this very specific angle from stage left was the simplest sort of idea that it needed, right? He just needed to dance in sort of moonlight coming from afar. And sometimes it's as simple an idea as that.
Mm. There's some elegance in the frugality of the design here, which I think translates not only in this image, but I'm sure if you were to see the dance piece, that would take it up a notch.
Yeah, for sure. So this is a dancer, Clifton Brown, who, Judy says, Miss Jamison says, he's the storytelling when he's standing still, so incredible, beautiful artist, Clifton Brown. So, doesn't take, especially with the Alvin Ailey Company, the joy of lighting a company like this is they are beautiful in work light. Right. So to be able to paint them with light and to help storytell and be a layer on top of that is it's an honor. Pushing through. This is it's actually only performed once for a special evening, but this is a piece called We by Robert Battle. That's Robert there actually dancing it. He's the artistic director of the Alvin Ailey American Dance Theater, and Renee Robinson, who is an incredible dancer who was with the company for many, many years. So this particular image I chose mostly to point out that sometimes you don't need frost in a gobo, and sometimes it doesn't need to be sharp, right? So what you're seeing here is from stage right, which would be on Robert's back. This is a keen example of just taking a gobo and running the barrel of the Lico and the light that you have it in slightly in. And what you see there is a slight color variation on his body, right? as we all refer to as chromatic aberration. It's basically when the light hits that moment inside of the gate, there's a little bit of a spectrum breakup that happens there. So you see a little bit of rainbow, you see a little bit of color dithering. It either sometimes goes slightly blue or slightly red, depending on where you are in the barrel line. But this was me just taking advantage of that I didn't have a prismatic, I didn't have a multicolor gobo, I didn't have lots of color in the side light in this particular moment. But I knew that through a slight variation of focus, I could create a side texture on a body that was going to be interesting and help show the emotion of this particular moment. So.
That's lovely. So you're telling me that there is no color filter or color of any kind. This is a fixture, a gobo.
That's correct. That's a white light fixture coming from stage right that is just barreled slightly in one direction. You can sort of see on his pants and on his back the sort of variation of color coming from that texture. And that is just the variation of having the barrel in a position where the texture and the light has that aberration. So. Pushing through. This is a piece, one of my favorite works I've been involved in over the years. It's a solo called Splendid Isolation 2 by Jessica Lang, who is the choreographer. This is for Ailey's second company, Ailey 2. And this is a section called The Calling. This particular image, again, we're talking about a situation with a dance company who doesn't have, Ailey 2 particularly, doesn't have a lot of resources. They tour to a lot of places where their plot is super small, and they want to be able to be accessible to communities and markets that the larger dance company or larger shows may not necessarily be able to get into. So I designed this particular piece with that in mind. What you're seeing here is basically two lights. What you're seeing is one Lico coming from the back as a sort of a backlight onto this body and onto the skirt, and one side light coming from stage left at a glow. And so that backlight, what's in that backlight, again, going back to texture, is a Roscoe standard gobo that we bought off the catalog. And then I actually took scissors to it and created an open space in the middle of the gobo because I loved the texture that I was going to get, but I wanted it to have this clearing, if you will. And I didn't have the ability to have one light on the skirt and one light on the body and one light on the face so that I have that very sort of ombre up to the body idea. I needed to do it with one light. And so I took a gobo, I cut the middle out of it, I put it in the middle, focused as a backlight, and then I put a color donut in. So again, going back to color donuts, it's a piece of gel with about a 50-cent piece of in the middle of either a different color or open white. You can do that too. I believe this was a dark purple on the outside and a sort of very, very pale lavender on the middle, and then played with focus. So what you get is this ombre of color around the perimeter of the skirt, a breakup that's sort of coming onto the skirt, and a backlight onto the body that's more pure with one light.
Sure. So you have taken existing tools, modified them. So you took a gobo and you cut the center of the texture out.
Yeah.
Physically cutting the steel pattern to where you have a more of an aperture in your gobo, and then you've taken color filter and you have cut out the center of, you've created a donut hole, right? You cut the center out of your gel so that when you projected, you had clear light that then falls off into that lavender.
That's right. And I think a shin from stage left at 20% to sort of fill in.
Yeah, wow, it's incredibly effective. And you said, what was the title of the piece again? Isolation?
The Splendid Isolation 2. Yeah, Jessica Lang has an incredible company who's doing beautiful work. So
it almost feels to me like by lighting her, but then surrounding her with this texture and this richer color, as as you said, it ombres darker towards the edge of the skirt. you have created an isolated moment, which I'm guessing is in the theme of the peeps.
Likely.
Nicely done.
Thanks. Pushing through. So this is a big throwback photo for me, but I pull it up often because it was really when I first began doing event design. This is from the Alvin Ailey spring event. It was in Harlem in a parking lot inside of a tent. And I was just, back then I was just completely, I had no fear. So I was just creating, having fun and layering and doing events and trying to have some exploration with everything that I could. So this particular event, again, it's in a classic century style tent, which we all do events in and weddings and things. But this was a festive evening. It was a moment of celebration. It was a moment of release and triumph. Sort of basically a party that celebrates the end of our U.S. tour, all the great work our Ailey school is doing with the students. So a fundraiser for that. So again, it's like an 18-year-old photograph, but I always bring it up because it was just, it's a good example of using a gobo as an idea of texture and sort of the celebratory nature. But this would be a very different look if the color was all the same, right?
Mm-hmm.
So again, when you're choosing textures, the idea of how you choose it, how you layer it, how you put colors next to each other with those textures, which might be layered or slightly layered, or maybe they're not completely layered. So you're trying to create more of a pure image like this as opposed to something that's super multi-dimensional. But how you layer in color on top of that texture is super important in how the texture itself comes off. That being said,
I mean, it certainly does speak to festivity, right?
Sure. So fast forward 20 years, different event, same gobo, because who doesn't love Runyon squiggles, right? But in a slightly different kind of layering and idea. This was for the Adrian Arce Center in Miami, more of a circus style theme event. This was a gala for kids and really focused on families, etc., with a lot of circus theme kind of things. So a texture is often a way of blurring the lines of existing architecture in an event or in a space. So like you saw earlier with Guys and Dolls, where we project a gobo on a 2D layered image so that we sort of trick the eye into not seeing the actual structures that those 2D drops are being painted on. But here in a situation where the guests for this event have come to this theater so many times, they know how the room looks. They know they come and see Broadway, they come and see opera, they come and see theater. The room is lit the way it normally is architecturally. And so to reinvent that experience so that an audience or a guest or a donor who comes to this theater all the time and they know what it is, to repaint the entire space with a texture suddenly blurs the lines of what they know, what they think they know about this space, what their expectation is when they come into this space, and then see it in a new light, so to speak, no pun intended. And
very
so
illuminating.
texture is a great way to do that. So.
Yeah, I think what also you've done here is you've invited the theatricality to be immersive, whereas I could see this venue oftentimes without the lighting along the walls as you've done it here. It could be very presentational. The theater stuff is happening up there on the stage. I am in this beautiful house of a gorgeous theater, and there is a separation by that fourth wall. Here you've drawn that in an immersive way.
Yeah. So again, event design. Here's a much more sort of painterly use of texture, if you will. Again, gobos on a standard gobos projected on a ceiling, but in a more layered, organic, maybe some might say elegant story kind of way. This is the Waldorf Astoria Hotel. This was an event for the Abyssinian Church. It's a celebration of, I think, 200 years, if I remember correctly. But so again, just wanting to, again, in some ways, reinvent the experience of being inside of this classic ballroom, this famous ballroom, but then create a, sort of painted, layered idea. And how do you choose what gobo is going to go on the ceiling? Well, sometimes it comes from centerpieces, right? It could come from the floral, the flowers that are around, the plants that are around. Maybe it's the textures on the tablecloths. Maybe it's the textures on the plates. We look for inspiration in all of these things to then translate that to not only color and a story of light, but into the textures that we use.
Right. Quickly, because I know we're running short on time, can you help the audience understand where are the lights that are shining onto the ceiling? Is that those that I see along the balcony?
Actually, yeah, I believe they're right on the rails. You can see the sort of balcony rails below where there's a combination of pin spots and things. I believe, if I remember correctly, are just from that position. So, and they were probably super wide. So, to get that sort of layered look, often, people will put in a light that's not as narrow, as wide as it really should be. And keep in mind that when you put a gobo in, it gets even smaller, right? So, one of our tricks is always go wider than you think you need to. And, for a textured idea like this, maybe use A-size gobos. So you're actually taking advantage of a larger part of the optical system of a Lico. You're actually getting more gobo for your buck, right?
Right.
Considering time, I'm just going to push forward. Again, this is an event at the White House. It's actually a state dinner for the president of China from a number of years ago. And this, again, was a situation where the event designers really wanted to create an experience that was transformative. And this is the state dining room of the White House. We wanted to kind of transform the experience of being in that space in a way that they'd not seen before. It's classically lit with normally with a chandelier and the candelabras, some sort of general white light ideas. But this particular design by our friends at Raffinelli they wanted this sort of whimsy to it. They wanted this sort of storyline of color, and I layer that in this sort of textural idea, but also color was, as you can see here, is a huge piece of it, wanting to frame out some architectural details that may have not been seen in this way previously. Just going to push. This is the Brooklyn Academy of Music, also known in the New York area as BAM. This was an event, highly textured concept of the facade of the Gilman Opera House. This was a special event for the retiring CEO, Karen Brooke Hopkins. As you can see, KVH, those are custom gobos. Again, here's an example of using a custom that needed to be scaled to fit a window. So obviously the math involved to make that work. But this is also a classic example of them wanting initially to do projection mapping and not having necessarily the resources or the desire to spend those resources on that for this particular event. And they came to me and said, can you give us the sort of quality of this, what we think of as projection mapping on a building with images, et cetera, but just do it with gobos and color and light. And so this entire event, there's no projection here. This is all custom gobos. It's all in moving lights ultimately, but it's basically a repainting of the facade of this building using the textures from the storyline of the gala event, the invite, etc. Completely contrasting idea. The Park Avenue Armories Gala from a number of years ago. Incredible design by David Mon, a very close collaborator. This, for me, is just showing a use of texture in a very sort of subliminal way, right? So yes, you can see on the floor there's a little bit of soft, diffuse texture around the space. But for me, it was about what does light look like as it in this sort of void environment that we've created. We wanted it to look like it went on forever. We are inside of a building where there are lighting positions and a ceiling, but I wanted the idea of it to feel like it was in infinity. So having that light coming from above, layering that light in, it felt too harsh. It felt too technical before I put a gobo in. And as soon as I put a gobo in and it could find that sweet moment of focus in light, it suddenly felt like it was more painterly, right? There was a larger emotional context to what really was just a bunch of lights focused down in a space, right? So, and suddenly it became a huge piece of the vocabulary of the event, whereas it might have just easily been some downlight focused on tables, right? So that's generally how we use texture here in a way that is a bit more subconscious. And then, so the last image here, again, going back to the White House for a moment, I'm trying to translate the golden years if you haven't realized that. Yeah, so this was, again, a private event, music event. Again, not as rich a color story as you saw in the previous event in this space. But again, the use of color on the ceiling, texture. This was, again, a stock gobo. It was a fall event. Some of the ideas were around apples and the sort of foliage that comes in the fall spirit. So we wanted to take that, again, use the use of split color with a texture on the ceiling and just do a little painterly sort of whimsy up there. So it doesn't have to be so multi-layered too. Sometimes if you don't have lots and lots of lights in a situation like this particular room, we're very, even a space like this in this particular building, there's limited power. So, I think the whole ceiling we did with maybe 6 lights, so it's, then you want to find more opportunities for layering through split color, through barrel position, so it feels like there's more lights than there actually are.
Wow, well, this is beautiful. Al, we've got a few questions coming through here, and I want to get to as many as we can. We have almost no time, but I'm going to ask you a couple of quick hitters, and if we can be succinct, we'll get to as many of these as possible.
Yeah.
One of the was, do you always use the same gobos for your gobo washes, or do you ever mix similarly themed gobos, which I think is an interesting concept of using multiple textures?
I absolutely do use multiple gobos. I do have a few go-to gobos, which I bet there's some folks on this call that are laughing right now. And honestly, it's because I have found some of them that give me that right layer of light and texture and organic edge that I know and I can expect. I know how it's going to react. And so, certainly I love layering new textures and trying new textures. I definitely have some go-to ones as well.
Great. And appreciating that we could probably do an entire webinar on this question, I'm going to ask you to give me your Reader's Digest answer. Beyond the hanging positions or limitations of the space in that capacity, are there any specific reasons that you choose an angle for your gobos?
Definitely. What is it that I'm hitting, right? So if I'm hitting a scrim, am I hitting a textured wall? Do I want a gobo to go in and blur the lines of, a seam that my decor team and partners are trying to not accentuate, right? So if you uplight a wall a certain way with a texture, it's going to show off a bunch of seams. But if I project a gobo right at it, it's actually going to blur those seams. And also reflection, right? Back to your eye. Light comes in at your eye depending on the angle you're hitting an object. So that certainly affects it as well. A backlight template is going to look different than a front light template on an object, right?
Yeah. Wow. And like I said, I think we could do another 45 minutes on that question alone. Well, Al, I can't tell you how much we appreciate it. Designers, if you want to design like Al, 791 Runyon Squiggle is one of his obvious go-tos. And of course, 78766 Crawford Leaf. And you can read the Spectrum blog post on how that Gobo was conceived and brought to life. I do want to thank everybody who participated in the conversation today. We got some great questions from the audience. Once again, Al, thank you so much for your time. This has been awesome.
It's totally my pleasure. Love chatting with you, Chad.
Always my pleasure as well, sir. And thank you, all of you. We will wish you a good day. Enjoy and have a wonderful and productive rest of your afternoon or morning. Thank you.